Welcome to Gaining the Technology Leadership Edge, a podcast for tech executives. We provide strategies and tactics to help executives succeed and further their career goals. With interviews from industry experts, leaders, and innovators, this show will surely get you on the edge of your seat with thought-provoking advice on how to stay ahead of the competition. Welcome to Gaining the Technology Leadership Edge, a podcast exploring the latest trends, strategies, and insights in technology leadership. We'll discuss the most important topics and ideas shaping the industry today, from emerging technologies to digital transformation and beyond. Join us to learn all of the juicy secrets of tech leaders, their biggest successes and failures, on our quest for gaining that all-important technology edge. Ready? Let's get started. Our guest today is Jeremy Nagel. Jeremy is a neurodivergent software developer turned startup founder. He sold his startup Smooth Messenger to MessageMedia in 2022 and now works at MessageMedia as a product manager. His new startup, Focus Bear, is a productivity and work-life balance app for people with ADHD. Welcome to the show.
Great to be on the show.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you. I mean, this is going to be an interesting discussion, I think. So why don't you just tell me a little bit about, what it was like to, go through your first startup and sell it and then start a second one?
Sure. The backstory there was I had worked as a Zoho consultant as a freelancer for about 5 years, beginning from when I graduated uni. So I was helping small businesses set up their CRM, write little code for them to automate some of their processes. And what I started to see was that clients were asking me to write the same code, essentially, that many of them wanted a way to distribute new inbound leads, as in people who were interested in their service, to their sales team equitably. And I wrote that about 3 times and then realized that there seemed to be a bit of a demand for it. I wrote a blog post and it suddenly became the most popular blog post on my site. And I realized then maybe there's actually demand for me to turn this into a product. Around that time, Zoho had launched their marketplace, which is a way for independent developers to put plugins available for sale. And I did my first plugin, Advanced Round Robin. It wasn't necessarily a huge money spinner, but I was getting consistent new customers coming in the door, paying for the product. And the best thing was, in the past, I had to help them one-on-one. And now I had a product which was generating monthly revenue, and I didn't really have to do that much. So that was very intoxicating, the idea that I could have a business that would be generating subscription revenue. And I had another job at the time. It was more of a side hustle for me. I was working as a software dev for an education technology company. But I started to see there was another opportunity around SMS, and that turned into Smooth Messenger, where businesses wanted to be able to communicate with their customers via SMS because they found that emails weren't really cutting through. And I built a plugin, and it ended up doing pretty well, a lot better than the Round Robin one did. And after 2 years, I had 500 businesses using it, and it became attractive for MessageMedia, which is a multinational SMS provider, similar to Twilio, if you know Twilio.
Yes.
And they ended up reaching out and making an offer, which was an attractive offer. And I ended up accepting it, selling the business. And now I'm working for them, basically doing what I was doing before, but within the confines of an organization.
Oh, that's cool. That's cool. And then tell me about Focus Bear.
Focus Bear, I actually started it because of work-life balance challenges that I was experiencing during the sale of Smooth Messenger. At the time, I had my day job. I was running Smooth Messenger, which meant I was waking up very early to deal with people in North America. I'm in Australia. So that was challenging in itself. And then there was the added stress of talking to lawyers and accountants about the sale process and negotiating to try and get a good deal. So I was finding that I was working from probably 5:30 a.m. until about 9 p.m. every day. I was feeling very stressed. I wasn't making time for meditation and exercise, which are 2 things which are really crucial for my mental health and my ability to concentrate. And as a consequence, I actually wasn't being very effective at work because I was so stressed and I wasn't doing my coping mechanisms. Work just piled up because I was flitting from task to task. I wasn't really going deep. And it meant that I was working all the time, but I wasn't being effective. I really wanted something that would A, help me block distractions while I was working, and B, help me stick to my positive habits in the morning. The early version of the app was basically a tool to stop me checking email first thing. It didn't let me check email until I had done my meditation and gone for a run. And I just did a 5-minute meditation and a 5-minute run because that's all the time I felt I had. And just doing that, it was amazing what a difference it made. Even though it's not a lot of time, it really did mean that I started the day feeling less stressed and I was able to be more effective throughout the day. And I gradually have increased that. Now I'm doing more like a 2-hour morning routine where I go for a half-an-hour run, I do some journaling, I do some creative writing, I do some meditation, some Chinese study, a bunch of other things. I start the day feeling really refreshed and energized to begin the day. And a lot of that is basically using the app to help me
stay focused. Yeah. That's
Yeah.
very interesting, because I think in my time in the tech industry, and especially now that as I think back about some of these people that I worked with, there's a lot of people in the tech industry that have ADHD, and they don't even realize it.
Yeah, I didn't realize until very late. I only got diagnosed last year.
Oh, really?
I have autism as well, and that's something that I've suspected all my life. But the ADHD was a bit of a revelation, and it was a realization that I had all these coping strategies that normal people don't need, that I have to have my packing checklist. Otherwise, I'll leave the door and I'll forget my phone or my lunch. And I have about 5 different calendars because without having constant alarms, I'm late for meetings. And it's been very freeing realizing that I'm not a broken person, that I actually, my brain works a bit differently. Sometimes it's in my favor, sometimes it's a disadvantage, but I'm learning some very specific strategies to help.
That's awesome. I mean, I think, I was actually diagnosed with ADHD when I was in my 30s. So it was about 20 years ago, and had a similar kind of revelation as you. It was like, oh, now I understand, why I do certain things the way that I do. And the same as you, like, I realized through life happening that I needed to cope with certain things differently than other people, but I wasn't really sure why. I just knew that that's, it was just how I had to operate. That's really interesting. So you have a similar story on that. So, we had mentioned, we had discussed a little earlier, tell me a little bit about, hiring neurodivergent people and retaining them, because I think people need to know this, because I think what has to happen, like my wife and I, we always have this thing, assume good intentions, and it avoids a lot of fights. And I think that what some employers need to do is maybe take a step back and think about the fact that maybe they're dealing with someone who's on the spectrum or someone who has ADHD, and you went through a whole interview process, you did all this stuff, you decided this was the person, then why all of a sudden dump on them because they're not exactly the kind of person you expect? So tell me what you think.
Sure. That's really true what you just said. I'll share from my experience, both of being a candidate myself and also hiring people in my company roles. And also I'll reference, there's a report called the Neurodiversity in Business report, which I think is worth technology leaders having a read. It has a lot of valuable information there, and it was only published a couple of months ago. So as a candidate, I got fired from my first 5 jobs. And that was really quite emotionally distressing for me.
I bet.
And I guess that's not just being a candidate, but also being on the job. But some of the things that I found hard, especially from the autism perspective, were coming into an environment where I don't know where the office is, I don't know how to get in, and that can be stressful, just getting there on time and not being frazzled. And the other thing is, I don't know what I'm going to be asked. I don't know, am I going to be asked to do a whiteboard interview, or is it going to be a cultural interview? Often not much information is shared, and it feels like more of a gotcha process rather than a collaboration where we're both trying to understand whether this is a fit. So what I really like is where organizations are super transparent about the process. Where am I going to be going? Who am I going to meet? What type of questions am I going to be asked? And that might feel like it's unfair. And it would be unfair if you only gave that information to neurodivergent candidates. Instead, I think we should take a universal design approach to recruiting. And we should think about, hey, is it actually better for everyone if we provide very clear directions for how to get into the room where someone's being interviewed? We can take photos, we can show them exactly the process for getting past security, who they need to talk to. That's going to mean that everyone gets there on time, because a lot of people will struggle with that. And the same thing with sending out questions beforehand. Everyone is going to do better if they know what type of questions are going to be asked. You're going to have more insightful conversations. And I think that the purpose of the interview should be really getting to know someone. And there's often concern about people not performing well due to nerves, because they're not proficient at impromptu speaking. And the question is, if you're hiring a software developer, do you want to hire someone who's super slick and who can be really good at answering questions on the fly? Or do you want someone who's able to give really considered responses that they've thought about a lot? And if that's your goal, then give them the opportunity to be considered by knowing what is going to be asked. They're probably the number two hacks. And then there are little things as well, like don't force someone to shake your hand, especially someone who's autistic. I don't really like being touched by strangers without knowing about it. So that there are little things like that, and also ways to shape the environment that it can be very hard for me to concentrate if there is a lot of background noise. If I can hear people talking in the background, I'm not going to perform well. It's hard for me to concentrate. So find ways to do the interview in a quiet environment, and potentially, if it's a remote role, it doesn't really need to be in person.
Yeah, that's interesting, because when I was in my first CTO role, in the like early 2000s, I had a developer that worked for me, and he had Asperger's. And one of the things, he finally came to me and he said, is there any other place around here, and like in this office, that I can work? It's too noisy here. I can't concentrate. And I said, well, no, not really, but I wouldn't have a problem if you worked from home, and just come in for the meetings that we have. And he was like, that would be great, really. And I gotta say, his productivity doubled. And like when we would do code reviews, the number of mistakes he made was really much lower. And I think what you just said is, what I really like about what you said was, you mentioned the point about helping neurodivergent candidates, but not just them, help everybody. And I think this is an important, like I actually do another podcast that I just started about the anti-work movement. And some of it I think is ridiculous, and some of it I think is absolutely spot on. Like, I look at things and people complain about, well, why is it that my boss can, contact me Friday at like, 10 p.m. and say, someone called out tomorrow, I need you in tomorrow, and then get mad at me that I didn't see it at, Friday at 10 p.m. And they're right. People are right about how they get treated. And I think more people need to think about each individual on their team, and what is that person's, it's kind of like asking someone what their love language is, right? Like how do you work best? Because whatever it is that you do, whatever it is you need in order to work your best, I want to give that to you as the leader.
That's another suggestion, actually, to ask everyone to fill out a user manual for themselves, so that they can share their preferences. What's going to work well? Do they prefer Slack? Do they prefer calls? Just so that their colleagues are going to understand how to best collaborate with them.
Yeah. I always had a rule. If I got an email and I responded to the email, and they responded back, and it just didn't seem like we were getting anywhere, I'd say, can I call you? It's just, sometimes it's just easier to deal with, verbally. And then there are people who, that's quite literally the only way that they want to deal with you, is verbally. They don't want to read and write back and forth and that sort of thing. So I mean, we have all these different ways of communicating today, but not all of them work for every person. I think that's really something that people also need to realize is, my approach is, if you have a problem with an employee, get to the bottom of it. Don't just, give up on them. Get to the bottom of it. Find out why the problem. Maybe it can be as simple as, they're having a problem in their relationship at home. and they're distracted. You might not be able to deal with that as the employer, but at least you know what's going on. What are some, so let's do this. What are some negative stories you have about dealing with employers with your autism? No need to name names.
Yeah. Some of the negative experiences I've had are one of my early jobs. I went to an overseas boot camp as a training program before I started the job. And I ended up not performing well in that environment because it was away from home. It was really high pressure, and it was just not really set up in a way that worked well for me. I think it was the wrong job. I don't think I would have made it a good consultant in a corporate environment, but I got fired from that because there were a few communication issues with my manager. And it's the sort of thing that really shattered my confidence, and the way that I was let go, it was really, they basically said, there's something wrong with you. We don't know what it is, but you're not going to work out in this situation. And with hindsight, I mean, if I had my diagnosis at that point, I probably would have been very upfront about it, and we would have made accommodations, and it would have gone differently. But it's something that like you said, when you're dealing with low performance, it's worth digging in and asking, is there anything that is causing this that we should understand? And maybe the person is actually, they might have ADHD, they might be autistic, or they might just have things going on in their personal life, but they might not actually realize that they have a brain that works differently. So it's important to be really compassionate is one thing I'd say, and realize that the way that if you do need to end things, that it could have real impacts on people. And if you look at the rates of unemployment amongst autistic people, it's a lot higher. We're talking 8 times higher than the general population. And it's not necessarily that they can't get a job, but it may be that they're scarred from one of their early employment experiences. So try and be really nice and give people a chance. I'm not saying keep them forever, because there are times where it's just not going to be a fit. And regardless of how hard you try, it's not going to work out, but try and be nice. That would be my request. And I'm going through that right now with someone in my team where there's a performance issue, and we're trying to figure out how to navigate that. And I think we've found some things that are helping. One thing that often helps for people with ADHD is body doubling, which is otherwise known as pair programming. Doing things together can mean that the productivity actually goes way up for both people. And that's something worth considering. A lot of organizations are opposed to pair programming because it can feel like a waste of time. But I think pragmatic pairing is a really good way for improving effectiveness for both neurotypical people and especially people with ADHD. And that might be something to consider if someone isn't performing well on their own and they seem like they're a social person. Suggest that they do more pairing.
That actually makes sense. I mean, I actually, later in my career, I shifted over to doing just consulting work, and I had a situation where I was leading this team, and this guy he'd say, "Oh, I've got a doctor appointment tomorrow morning. I'll be in the office at 9:30." It'd be like 1:00, no call, no show, no nothing. And so I took him for a walk to go to get coffee, and I started talking to him about it, and it kind of shocked me. He was like, well, with my Asperger's, I've heard this before. Like, okay. So I delved into it a little bit with him, and sure enough, he had a situation like you're describing where he had a very negative experience with a past employer who just didn't understand him at all, didn't want to understand him, and treated him like he was the worst employee he'd ever had, which clearly he was not. But interestingly, after we had that conversation and I showed him that I was sensitive to his situation, the telling me he was coming in at 9:30 and not showing up till 1:00 stopped. And I wonder if part of that is just like, I know people go through traumas, and then they're like, oh God, I'm about to face that same thing again. I don't even want to deal with that. I'm just going to avoid this as best I can. And I wonder if that was part of what was going on with him, because as soon as he knew that I had empathy towards his situation, it was a totally different scenario. But you are right. I think there are situations where it just wouldn't be a good fit. I mean, I think just like I could never work with somebody who is a big micromanager, I think there's just people who couldn't, the other way around, couldn't deal with some of the intricacies of the relationship with that type of employee. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I actually think that's just typical of, all employees, right? You're either going to get along with the people you work with or you're not, or you are a fit or you're not. I mean, I think it's that simple. So, all right. So that's the negative story. How about a positive story?
In my current role, I really feel like there's a lot of ways that I'm able to lean into my strengths. And some of the accommodations that I have, they're helpful for everyone, but basically working from home, like you said, with your employee, that's been really helpful for me, just not dealing with the open plan environment and not struggling with all the noise and the need to, it's called masking, where you're probably familiar with it, where people who are autistic, particularly, and ADHD have to almost put on an act in order to appear normal, and that can be very draining. So it's something that it's fine to do in certain circumstances, that there are times where I need to go into the office and I can do that, and it's not a problem for me to be in for a day. But if I'm in there for 5 days, then I start to feel really drained by the end. So very grateful for the flexibility there. And then some of the other things are that I'm able to have flexibility with timing as well, that I'll have doctor's appointments or I'll have podcast interviews, and my manager isn't micromanaging me. It's more of a results-based management, that as long as I'm getting the work done, the time at which I do it doesn't matter. And then one other thing that has been really a struggle in the past and is now better is we used to have these huge meetings with about 20 people, no agenda, and I wasn't really sure what the point of it was. And I'd be in there and I'd try and listen, but I found it really boring because I wasn't really involved a lot of the time. And I'd end up just going and checking my emails or doing some coding work. And I spoke to my manager about that, asking, hey, I think the purpose of this meeting is so that other people in the team get to know what I'm working on and we give each other some feedback. Would it be okay if we experimented with breakout rooms instead, where instead of the whole team needing to listen to one person, we could break out into groups of 3, and we could, in that group of 3, we could go a bit deeper on the problems that we had. We experimented with that and everyone really liked it. It felt like the conversations were deeper. I felt a lot more engaged, and the meeting seemed to become more productive. And we still shared some of the highlights of that conversation afterwards in the broader group, but it meant that the meeting was a lot more dynamic, and some of the insights, instead of maybe 2 people talking and 18 people being silent, instead it was everyone getting a chance to be involved. So I think that's something to be aware of as well, that developers don't really like meetings, but if we make the meetings a lot more focused and smaller teams or smaller groups, then they can actually be a really good way to bond and a really effective way to solve problems.
Yeah, I think it's all about compassion, right? I mean, that's really what it comes down to, is thinking about your fellow humans. I really think that is a big cause of the anti-work movement, is that people aren't compassionate towards one another. And after a while, people can only take it so long, and then they explode, for lack of a better way to put it. So how do you personally, with these kinds of things that have happened to you, and, understanding your situation, how does that affect how you operate with your own team?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could say I was always compassionate, but there have been times where I haven't really been inquisitive about why someone has acted in a certain way. And that's something that I'm really trying to get better at as a leader in my organization, that I I need to pause before I respond. And that there have been times, you talked about explosions, there have been times where I haven't quite exploded, but I've been at least somewhat passive aggressive or snide in my remarks, that if I felt like someone isn't pulling their weight. And that's something that I don't admire in myself. And that's part of why I'm doing the meditation in the morning and doing some of those other practices to get myself into a space where I can be compassionate. And that really does help, that if I pause in a proactive manner, so doing some meditation, taking a lunch break where I'm not working at the same time, then I find at times where someone says something that in my head, I'm thinking, gee, that was a really dumb comment. Instead of responding immediately, I'm able to pause and give them the benefit of the doubt, like you said. So I'm trying to get better at it myself. And I think I have definitely noticed a performance improvement amongst the people in my team after taking that more compassionate approach. And I'm noticing them lean a lot more into their own strengths. My moods definitely affect my team's moods.
Well, yeah, that is 100% the truth. I mean, people need to realize that too, I think. You're very in tune to these kinds of things, which is actually rather unusual, just in the tech world in general, because I mean, not to say that tech people are narcissistic, but they do kind of have those tendencies of think about themselves. And so it's great to see. It's one of the things I work with clients on all the time is, have a little bit of empathy. There's a reason you hired the person. Why all of a sudden are you not understanding that, maybe this isn't a normal behavior for a reason, maybe you should find that out. That's really interesting to me. So, where are we at here?
Can I say,
go ahead.
Can I say one other thing about recruiting I forgot to mention before?
Oh, sure.
Which is whiteboard interviews. I think that would be one other thing I'd suggest avoiding. That, I mean, it's probably okay if you give someone advance notice, but I guess the purpose of a whiteboard interview is to test someone's communication skills. But if you're using it as a way of testing someone's coding fluency, I don't think that's a good test, because developers don't normally code on the whiteboard. And often some of the negative experiences I've had with code tests are where I've been asked to, for example, write a binary tree implementation as a front-end developer. And that's not something I would ever do on the job. Even Codility and HackerRank, I've found that not to be a good experience, because the tasks that I'm asked to solve are not relevant to the type of work that I'm doing. So I'd really suggest that everyone look very carefully at how coding interviews are done. That, again, we want it to be a test of someone's the ability to considerately approach a problem, and often that requires some time. So I much prefer, when I interview candidates, I prefer looking at a portfolio and then asking them to explain some code that they've written, because that means that they have familiarity with the code. And then I do need to test that they actually wrote the code and that it wasn't something that they pasted off the internet. But I find doing more of a pairing interview where I say, hey, this looks cool. Can we write unit tests for this particular function? And then I get to see how we would collaborate together, how they communicate, and whether they deeply understand the code.
Yeah, it's interesting. I agree with you on that. I mean, I just think in general, it's about the whiteboarding stuff can be a really bad idea. It's different if they want to see general concepts, like that you're understanding a general concept. Like explain encapsulation to me, write it down here real quick. And you can use pseudocode and it doesn't matter. But what drives me crazy, I actually had an interview once where they wanted to know in the Visual Studio IDE, what's the menu option for running the code in debug mode? I never do that. I use the button. And so I'm like, you should know that. Why should I know that? I don't use that. I use the shortcut. I mean, it's like, tell me someone's phone number these days. No one remembers anyone's phone numbers because it's all on speed dial. It reminds me of like like what you're talking about, I love the idea of sitting them down, looking at the sample code and saying, hey, can you explain this to me? Or how can we write a unit test for this? Because it shows you they know the code and they wrote it and they understand it. Versus here, write this code. First of all, sometimes it feels like they're trying to get some free work done, that sort of thing is always an interesting issue. But also, I think that you put so much pressure on a person right on the spot. And I remember one time though, I kind of shut this guy up real quick. I was on an interview and it was going to be a contract position. And he was like, so I want you to write a query that does this. And I said, well, I've never actually done it before, but I'm sure that if I were to use Google, I could find it. Oh, you'll never find this. It's not going to be, you can't find it. So I said, can I use your laptop and try? I Googled, it was the first line, right away. And I said, see, I could do it. And I wrote the query and I ran it. And I kind of proved to him that it's kind of pointless to ask that question, because if I knew how to do it, I would have just done it, but I didn't know how to do it. So now I do know how to do it. I found out and now I can use that. I think he was slightly shocked by the fact that, look at this guy, like he actually found the answer that I thought was impossible to find. So
yeah, and especially with ChatGPT these days, that it's more about, I think the key thing is not can someone solve the problem, but can someone understand the code that is output by an LLM and make sure that it doesn't have obvious bugs in it.
Well, yeah, it's like I used to work with this guy and he'd go on Stack Overflow and he'd go, oh, I found the answer. And then 20 minutes later, I'd say, I thought you found the answer. It doesn't work. Yeah, that's because they didn't promise you the syntax was going to be perfect. Someone just whipped up some code to answer your question, I always found that to be a fun and interesting exercise to watch someone like take the code and then they're like, oh my God, they're like the syntax errors that are in here are crazy. Well, of course they are. I'm sure someone just whipped that out on their phone and who knows how many typos are on there and whatever else. So what are your future plans?
Future plans are really to go deeper with Focus Bear. So that's currently, we've got 25 customers so far, 100 users using it, and working on the mobile app to make it. Right now, the desktop apps work well, but the mobile apps need a bit of work. And I'm really enjoying refining the product and getting feedback from other people. And I'm hoping that that's going to turn into a business that I can work on full time. So I feel very passionate about empowering people who are neurodivergent to do better in the workplace and also to have better work-life balance. That's part of it too. I use the app to have a strict cutoff time of 5 p.m. At that time, it locks me out of my computer and I can only get access if my wife puts in the password. And that's been hugely beneficial for my relationships and my health and my sleep. And I really wish that for everyone, that they can really crush it at work, but also have an awesome personal life and be fit and healthy.
Perfect. Well, why don't you let the listeners know where they can find you?
Absolutely. On focusbear.io is the best place to learn about my work, and you can contact me via that site as well using the contact form. And I'm also on LinkedIn, happy to connect on LinkedIn.
I'll make sure this gets into the show notes and the YouTube description. But thanks for being on the show. Really appreciate it. Interesting conversation. Completely different perspective than anyone that's been on the show before. But thanks again.
Really great talking. Thanks a lot for having me, Mike.
Sure. Well, thanks for tuning in to Gaining the Technology Leadership Edge. We hope you had a great time with us learning everything you need to know to stay ahead of the technology curve. Remember, be curious, be updated on all the latest trends, and show them who's the boss. And until next time, we'll be back with plenty more techie tips and tricks so you can stay on top of your game.